Hello. Now I want to focus on the second half of Chapter 9, which concerns ethnic differences in drinking patterns. It concerns problem drinking and the effects of this, as well as potential interventions and public policy directed toward reducing the harms caused by drinking. So we start with ethnic differences in excessive drinking and different ethnic groups. Irish people have a long established reputation for excessive drinking. In Irish society, there are a combination of factors related to this. One, they have advocated a pattern of high socioeconomic aspirations, late marriage, and other things. So the high socioeconomic aspirations, as I mentioned before, drinking tends to be greater among people who are more educated. Late marriage, again, single people tend to drink more. And then the second sub-bullet there, this has resulted in what your text refers to as bachelor groups, where married men are taking out young men and socializing them into their drinking practices. If you look at Italians, there's a tradition in Italy which is high alcohol consumption, but mainly of wine with meals. And the other point there, 70% of men and 94% of Italian women do all of their drinking at mealtime. If you look at French people, there is a development of alcoholism at a much higher rate among the French because of drinking patterns. And here are some of them. French people consume distilled spirits and aperitifs both between and after meals, so more continued drinking. French parental attitudes either favor or oppose wine drinking among children. So it's interesting that you can have some people who actually favor wine drinking for children. France has a higher acceptable alcohol consumption quantity than in Italy, so the amount consumed is higher. The norms are okay with that. And French people associate drinking, particularly copious amounts of it, large amounts of it, with virility. In terms of Asian Americans, Asians typically consume less alcohol than compared with other races in the United States. Asians consume alcohol largely as a part of social functions rather than as an individual drinking. These groups in the social arenas disapprove of public drunkenness, and they educate children to observe these patterns. So this is indoctrinated early on as a socialization practice with children. Native Americans experience a higher rate of problems with alcohol consumption. Alcohol consumption among Native Americans and on reservations is a particularly big problem. And in Nebraska, we have the issue of the Ogallala tribe and the White Clay city, the town that used to sell a lot of alcohol to those people who were on the Pine Ridge Reservation. The reservation itself was dry, but people would come down to this very, very, very small town specifically to buy alcohol, and it was one of the highest rates of alcohol sale per capita, per person, in a town in the United States. Now recently that's been addressed, and I believe that there are changes being made so that the White Clay is no longer selling alcohol, at least the way it did. Anyway, Native Americans have very high rates of problems with alcohol. Drinking patterns reveal excessive alcohol consumption is mainly by young, unemployed males, and alcohol-related causes contribute to a large proportion of Native American death, early death. Hispanic males, Latinos, display relatively high rates of alcohol use and heavy drinking. Hispanic adolescents have the highest rates of heavy alcohol use among minority populations. Drinking in general and excessive drinking seem to be associated with what's called acculturation, which is if you're acculturated, then you accept and adapt to a new social environment. the cultural norms of that environment. So these ethnic patterns in the United States may be a result of acculturation to those norms in the United States. So as an example of this, your text mentions that acculturated Hispanics, meaning people of Hispanic origin, Latin American origin who've come to the United States, they tend to drink more than do Hispanics living in Mexico or Spain. African Americans experience higher rates of alcoholism than do whites. And as the frequency of heavy drinking increases, rates of drinking problems rise faster among black men than among white men, according to a study by Hurd. Culture, not race or biology, determines patterns of alcohol consumption by blacks or by African Americans. The point here being that it isn't about genetics or biology, it's culture related, so patterns related to the people you're around and their patterns and relationship to alcohol. A question for you for review if you've read the material. Though nearly blank percent of the US population drinks alcohol, actual consumption patterns show a very uneven distribution throughout the drinking population. So the question is asking you, what percentage of adults in the United States drink? The answer may or may not surprise you, 2/3. Which allows me to continue on with the extent of alcoholism and problem drinking. Nearly 2/3 of the US population is drinking alcohol. However, as that statement from the last slide said, the actual consumption patterns show a very uneven distribution throughout the drinking population. Some groups and categories drink far more or far less than others. European countries post some of the highest estimates of alcoholism in the world. You can consider too the costs of alcoholism. These can be myriad, take many forms. One, industry, places of employment, can lose large sums of money because of the problems caused by excessive alcohol consumption. And that can be through a result of absenteeism, people not coming into work, inefficiency on the job, and accidents related to employment. Other costs might be more social in nature. They might be also individual. So poor health, if a large percentage of people are drinking and having poor health, that becomes a public health concern. Emotional distress and the loss of relationships are also problems. And the ultimate cost, death, premature death. If we discuss alcohol-related crime, here are some patterns. Higher rates of arrest are for public drunkenness among the lower classes rather than higher classes, which makes intuitive sense. Lower classes have people who are more generally in the public eye, as their property and place of living is not usually very comfortable. So higher rates of public drunkenness and arrest. There's also a high recidivism rate, which means a repeat of an offense, which applies to the concept of a revolving door. So what happens is people who are arrested for public drunkenness are not arrested once. It usually happens again and again and again. So there's a flow of these cases repeatedly through the criminal justice system, which costs taxpayers money. And finally, drunkenness plays a role in violent crime, which is interesting because alcohol is a depressant. So you would think that it depresses the central nervous system, slows down breathing and heart rate, and would therefore make people less able to do violent crime. However, it also reduces inhibitions and therefore can result in violent crime. Drunk driving is a major concern. Alcohol plays a major role in the number of traffic crashes that result in fatal accidents. More than 120 million Americans are licensed drivers, and close to 100 million of those people drink. So the number of people who drink and also have driver's licenses shows you the extent to which there may be problems with that overlap. Current law in all states defines drunk driving as operating a car while your blood alcohol level, BAL, is over 0.08%. So these are measured scientifically or empirically, I should say, through breathalyzers that can read the exact amount of alcohol that's in your system at a given time. There can be technologies used to address this. One of them is called the interlock system. Perhaps you've heard of it. If you have a friend who's ever had a DWI, then they might have that system in their car, and they might have to breathe into it before they can turn the key in the ignition. So this is a system preventing drunk drivers from starting their cars, and it's used to block opportunities for future drunk driving. States also have enacted what I've mentioned before, implied consent laws, so that when you get a driver's license, you're basically giving the state implied consent to test you for alcohol. If you refuse, then that is also a crime. Group associations and subcultures and their identification play an important role in determining who becomes an excessive drinker. Maybe you've heard that phrase from when you were a child, show me who your friends are, and I'll show you who you are. So the people you hang around with influence behavior. Rates of alcoholism and problem drinking may partially reflect the integration of drinking behavior into the patterns of the subculture. So the relative importance and prominence of drinking within a subculture will affect drinking patterns. The role of group and subculture factors influence excessive drinking and alcoholism in many different ways, which are listed. Gender differences, men versus women. The choice of companions when drinking. Who do you want to be around? Skid row drinking, which is a reference to certain areas which alcoholics populate in cities. There are a larger number of drunk people. Occupational differences in excessive drinking. Believe it or not, higher level occupations have generally higher rates of drinking. Doctors and dentists have high rates of drinking. Religious differences and ethnic differences, both of which we discussed previously. If you're talking about gender differences in drinking, more men drink alcohol than do women. Men are more likely than women to frequent public drinking houses, bars and taverns, and they generally consume larger quantities of alcohol. Gender roles may result in society stigmatizing women's drinking as socially unacceptable. So those roles may lead to the patterns of behavior. There's a discussion about drinking among homeless people and Skid Row in your text. Group drinking plays a major role in the lives of homeless men living on Skid Row, and my own research on homelessness concerned at some point going to a public park where alcoholics would get together who were also homeless and basically drank. And that was their group and how they saw themselves. Anyone else was an outsider. If you were not homeless and interested in drinking, you really weren't part of that subculture. These people drink as a symbol of social solidarity and friendship, and that's what I found in my research as well. And the culture fully accepts group drinking and collective drunkenness. So this is the work of a guy named James Stradley, and it's called You Owe Yourself a Drunk from 1970. But even 50 years later, these things seem to be still relevant. By the way, the phrase Skid Row comes from Stradley's work. It was about Seattle, and what happened was drunk people would typically be on a road, I should say, where there would be logs. It was a logging road, and so the logs would skid down the road. So that's how we get this phrase Skid Row for places that have nothing to do with logging, just cities and the places where people drink. I mentioned occupations and excessive drinking. The percentage of drinkers in a group tends to increase with rising occupational status. So the higher your education and economic status and occupational status, likely the more you'll drink, the more likely you are to drink. So business settings can also be a prominent place for alcohol consumption over sales, negotiating, meeting with lawyers, etc. Male-dominated occupations like the military, construction, and building trades can also include a high proportion of excessive drinkers. And overall, drinking may become part of business practices, which is the idea of being accepted by coworkers. People say, let's go out to the bar, and that becomes something that people are habituated into, for example, when becoming lawyers or becoming physicians. Let me now consider religious differences in excessive drinking. Those who tend to declare religious preferences tend to abstain more often and to drink heavily less than those who declare no such preferences. So religiosity tends to be associated with lower rates of alcohol consumption. Alcoholism and problem drinking violate social norms, and those are norms concerning the moderate and otherwise appropriate use of alcohol. Anyone of you who's ever been around somebody who drinks to excess can understand why that is deviant. Drinking that goes beyond public accepted norms and group practices result in applied sanctions and other forms of social control. So as other forms of deviance, you have the idea of sanctions, norms, and social control. Early attempts in the United States to control alcohol consumption included things like the era of Prohibition in the 30s, where manufacturing and sales of alcoholic beverages were outlawed. So this was a period in the United States where alcohol was made illegal. Legal regulation strategy applies the law to establish standards backed by legal sanctions for acceptable practices in manufacturing, distributing, and in consuming alcohol. You can also try to educate people about the consequences of using alcohol. What are the results of drinking? What are the results of excess drinking? What might be the results of drinking while pregnant? So you might know when you look at a can of alcohol or a bottle that there will be warnings related to the use of vehicles perhaps, but also to, especially for pregnant women, to avoid alcohol use. Also too, there can be campaigns to reduce alcohol drinking through promoting non-alcoholic beverages. And sometimes in bars, the designated driver will have basically free soda or juice all night long to, kind of reward that person for that altruistic behavior. There are different models for understanding alcoholism. The psychoanalytic model: alcoholism is a symptom of some underlying personality disorder, not unlike the way that we talked about the psychoanalytic model in previous sections. You can also use the family interaction model, and that regards alcoholism as a family problem, not an individual one. So the family of orientation, the family you grow up in, can strongly relate to your perceived, your perceptions of alcohol and perceived positive or negative use of that substance. The behavioral model conceives of alcoholism and treats it as a behavior or a set of behaviors rather than a disease. So instead of using a medical kind of model, you would look at the actual behavior someone's doing and try to do an intervention in the way that they act. Biological model: this focuses on biological antecedents of alcoholism and attempts to explain those as a biological predisposition to the condition. So as an example of this, you might say people who look for an alcoholism gene or other physiological factors that may predispose someone to alcoholism. Last few, the medical model considers alcoholism as a disease and focuses on treatment by medical measures. When you consider alcoholism as a disease, it raises some interesting questions. Is a person therefore really responsible for this? Should the person be blamed for their drinking? You could say if, for example, someone is diabetic, you wouldn't say, wow, it's terrible that you're a diabetic. You you are deserving of punishment for this. No, the medical model says treatment is the route to helping the person, and that blaming the person doesn't really get you anywhere. There are combined perspectives as well, and these are claims that alcoholism can occur from many different factors: biological, psychological, familial, social class, and sociocultural risks, and some researchers there who are investigating those connections. Different types of programs involve community-based treatment. This would be providing counseling and other services to problem drinkers through a few things. One would be community-based referral and treatment centers for problem drinkers, outpatient counseling, and also hospitalization. Committed alcoholics may well need hospitalization to dry out, to avoid the DTs, and to avoid accidental death through alcohol withdrawal. These facilities spread out in communities across the U.S. as a result of a particular act, the Uniform Alcoholism and Intoxication Treatment Act, going back around 50 years. Alcoholics Anonymous is another popular method for treating alcoholism. It revolves around a book published in 1939, which was the core philosophy of the organization, a 12-step program. AA, as it's commonly known, is developed into, as it says, the most widely known program and possibly the most successful. How does it work? People meet in groups and they state their name and that they're an alcoholic. And despite that, they're telling their stories as a way of delabeling that person so that they can move back into society as a contributing independent individual. So there's a little bit of a contradiction there. You claim that you're an alcoholic and that you are now in the process of changing and addressing that condition. So there's a little kind of contradiction there. However, it seems that this does work for a number of people, and people will say that I am a recovering alcoholic to imply that they're moving away from these terrible patterns. The rates of success, though, it's hard to measure for AA because the groups don't maintain attendance records. Attendance is anonymous. And these final 12 steps, you can take a look at them. They are very useful to think about in terms of not just alcoholism, but how you might approach righting a wrong with other people, and the connection that some people have with a spirituality that allows them to overcome personal problems. So as I mentioned a minute ago, AA members describe themselves as recovering alcoholics, discrediting the notion that once an alcoholic, always an alcoholic. According to AA, an alcoholic may never return to drinking again without becoming a problem drinker. So this is the idea of complete abstinence, as opposed to sometimes people having systems of moderation, which they use to deal with alcohol.